Okay, honey, I'm just gonna go for a little walk, and I'll be back in a little bit, okay? I'm just gonna go in the neighborhood.
Have a good time.
Okay. I will. You know how you go through life and you are living it, you aren't thinking about it or turning it over in your mind all the time at all. So looking back, I realize how unusual Norman is in a lot of ways.
He was remarkable in his joie de vivre. He loved life. He enjoyed doing things. He was outgoing. He enjoyed people. He had two major passions, and we all recognize this. His love for my mom and his love for the company. He truly loved that company. He had a sense of honesty and integrity that carried him through. He was proud of his work, he loved the people he worked with, and he was one of those persons who believed in working hard and playing hard. The O.C. Tanner Company would never have grown and developed the way it did without Dad's energy, his enthusiasm, his salesmanship. He was a huge part in the development and making it from a very small operation within the confines of Utah to a national company and then an international company. I really wanted to honor Mom and Dad. I want that legacy to be known.
Sometimes when I think about the success of this company, I think it is a real American success story because they just had really one full-time employee that made 3 counting Obert and Norman. And by the time the war started and he left, they had 28, I think it was. And now we've got close to 1,500 at least. When Norman and Obert started together, they were a good team. And they both liked each other, and they got along well. Norman was all action, and Obert was contemplative. But it was a combination that made it really interesting. And Obert was basically an academician. And he loved ideas and books. And Norman was an extrovert, extreme extrovert. So he loved to get out and travel and doing anything he could to sell people on the O.C. Tanner Company.
He had a charisma that when he would walk into a room, it was obvious that he was in charge, and people gravitated to him. In a short period of time, he could create a long-lasting relationship with a person.
The calls that I would go with Norman, and these people hadn't met him, within 5 minutes, he had them. Maybe one of the great characteristics of Norman is his honesty. The fact that he was so open and above board and so giving, people gravitated toward Norman. And Norman could relate to anyone.
They were quite poor. They started out with nothing. His mother was a musician, and she played the piano, and she had worked her way through school. And Norm's father worked on the railroad, so they started out very humbly. But eventually, he left the railroad entirely and went into selling life insurance. And they moved out of this little town. And Norm's father had always wanted them to be close to university. Norm's parents both just expected that their children would go to college, and they all did. They weren't a studious couple themselves, but they all had the ability to work. Norm started supporting himself when he was just a kid. He said he never took money from his parents after he was 12. And his mother recognized that he was very honorable, very honest as a kid, and hardworking. He had a real conscience about earning his own money and being independent. He started out as a kid selling newspapers, and I think his first job was selling them in a Holy Cross hospital to just patients. And he got so he knew the patients, and it was quite a learning experience for him. He was a good kid, but he was also troublesome in a sense. And he was always active and busy. I think he probably would drive his mother crazy because he had so much energy. He was so quick, and he just moved so fast and everything that it was a great advantage to him in some ways later in life because he could outwork anybody. When he was 14 years old, he and a friend, a neighbor boy, decided they wanted to go to California to see the ocean. I'm sure this was Norm's idea, and he got him in, just into his plot. But Norman didn't tell his parents, of course. So during the night, he got up and met his friend, and they left in the middle of the night. The road was just a gravel road, just a two-way gravel road in those days. But anyway, they got partway between Las Vegas and California, and Norm's motorcycle broke down. And he hauled it to the nearest gas station and asked the fellow there if he could fix it. And the fellow said, "Oh, there's no way to fix this." He said, "It's ruined." He said, "You'd have to get a whole new engine," and so on. So Norman and he hitchhiked the rest of the way to the ocean. And they got to the ocean. They took off their clothes and went swimming in the ocean, and then they were ready to go back home again. I was on the Weber College debating team, and he was representing the University of Utah. I was introduced to Norman, and he really immediately started asking me to go out. And as soon as we went out the first time, he never took another girl out. And he went home and told his mother. He said, "Mother, I found the girl I want to marry." It took me a little while before I realized that I really was in love with him too. It was a case of it kind of growing with me. I just became more and more aware of how unusual he was in a lot of ways. He was so considerate of everybody. He just would go out of his way for a friend.
When we would see Norman and Barbara together, you saw the most loving, caring, delightful couple ever. Such an amazing match.
Mom was very supportive with Dad as he built the company. She was right behind him all the way. They knew how to work and play together. And they just adored each other.
And we had come through the Depression, so it was terribly important to both of us that we be successful. But we rented an apartment, and I remember when we went, the landlady said, "Well, do you have any furniture?" And we said, "No, we didn't have anything." And so she said, "Well, maybe we can help you a little bit." She said, "We've got some furniture people have left, leftover furniture in the basement." And she said, "We can maybe get enough for you to get by." She was really helpful. And so we went down her basement where they had stored a few things, and we got enough furniture that we were able at least to have a sofa and a few chairs and a bed.
When they were first married, they had very little money. She actually had just gotten her bottle of milk. It was delivered in those days. And she dropped it and the whole bottle broke. And she started to cry because they had so little money. I mean, you couldn't just go run out and buy another bottle of milk.
Well, Norman started first with Obert, just doing some handwork and making the jewelry when he was probably just maybe a little in college, a little bit in high school. And it was that time that Obert approached him and asked him if he'd work for him. Obert was then planning to go to Stanford, and he was looking for someone to take over this little pin and ring business. At that time, he was the only one other than the fellow that was making the pins. Even though Norman hadn't had much experience selling, Obert couldn't help but see his ability to get along with people and to sell. Immediately, Norman started making friends and selling and increasing even the high school business. That first year, he started also selling a few little pins to fraternities and sororities. And Norm said the potential is great. And this is while Obert was gone after Norman took over that first year. Then he went to the Utah Power and Light and all the little businesses around here trying to stir up business for pin making. And it opened up a whole field, of course, of possibilities outside of Utah.
Dad was just the backbone of the company. He did just about everything.
Over 2 years, he really started expanding the company. And then we moved to the back of the Atlas building where he could get 3 rooms for the same price as the room that he was renting in the front. And then he got a secretary part-time and a man that was an artist who could cut dies as well as draw pictures of proposed pins. By the time he was called into the Army, 4 years later, we had 27 employees. And in the meantime, he had sold several national accounts, sizable accounts, that really kept us going during those war years when nobody could travel and there was no one out really selling.
One day, Obert and Norman were skiing, and they heard about Pearl Harbor. And they came down, and Norman joined the Army, and he became part of the Army Air Corps.
You'd been exposed to the horrors of war. Were you prepared for Dachau?
Not at all. War was a piece of cake compared to what I saw at Dachau. I didn't have a problem. I got hit once when an airplane had to land with a broken wheel and so forth. But I wasn't injured, and I had people lost in my outfit, which was tragic. But what I saw there was the most disturbing thing that ever happened to me in my life.
Actually, the war wasn't over when he was released. He had a permit to come home and spend so much time because he had so many hours of flying. And they gave him all what they called R&R, and he was able to come home. But when he first came back anyway, just anything that was business looked good to him. And he never after that talked much about the war. He seemed to want to forget it and just put it behind him. He even started trying to sell when he was still in uniform. He had to wear his uniform when he got home for a while. That was the rule.
Dad had always hated war after what he had seen in World War II. And then the Vietnam War and how it didn't make sense and the civil rights issues.
Norman and I had the same social values. We both wanted to help our community. We both wanted to change society. And we both were a little bit, in a sense, kind of rebels in that we just wanted to see some real social changes. And then, too, when Norm came back from the war, he was a real peacenik.
He came back in 1945 and began again to sell for the company. And after the war, the company reached $1 million in sales. Obert continued to teach at the University of Utah. Norman continued to sell.
Norman, from the very beginning, could see the opportunities. He could see he would have to move out of Utah and sell to the whole United States. And there was no limit on what we could do and how much we could grow. And from the very beginning, he wanted to make quality merchandise. And as time went on, we led the industry really in improving the merchandise and adding jewels to it.
At that time, Lenny Hilton was head of manufacturing. If there were any problems in the production line, any glitches, Lenny and he would discuss them. They'd go figure out how to solve the problems. That was what was so fun about my dad. He was just a problem solver.
The company went from a cheap pin that sold for $1 or $1.25 to gold. And they began to say that employees deserved the best. And O.C. Tanner really grew when they put gold and silver and precious stones into their products. And they went from one of the competitors to the overwhelmingly largest, most powerful competitor in their industry.
I remember when he came back and said he'd sold General Motors. And I thought, my God, General Motors, how did you get in the door? You know? But he always found a way, and the secretaries always liked him. And he'd get to know the secretaries, and then he'd remember their birthday or something, and he would get in all these doors that I thought were closed to a little company back in Utah. You know?
Mom used to go on some of his business trips with him when she could. They had Susan and Clark with them, and they were driving up in the Northwest, and they were driving along, and Dad saw this huge factory, and they just stopped, and they didn't know what it was, and Mom stayed in the car with Clark and Susan, and Dad went inside, and about half an hour later, or maybe longer, he came back out, and he had made a sale, and it was Boeing Airlines.
Obert was wonderful in the competitive world. Norman added the sales energy, and so, as with any company, great contributions are made by various people, and in this case, where you've got two principal people, then you have enormous contributions from both of them that were complementary.
I have fond memories of Obert. When we were kids, we would stop at their home with Christmas presents and see Grace and Obert and the kids, and I remember all of those kids coming to our house. But there was a lot of interaction, and people would say to us, oh, what an interesting combination, these two men, that they have this company together. You know, because one is very intellectual and one is a doer, a go-getter.
Obert and Norman thought differently, they considered things differently, and produced a tremendous power in the company. They were small, they had terribly large competitors. It was a fearsome climate in which they worked.
We still didn't have any good capital base, and we never had credit with a bank. Harold Still asked Norman to come and see him, and he said, Norman, what you need is a line of credit. From then on, we had a line of credit, and we had an opening to hire more salesmen and get started in a really sophisticated way, not always being tied to this lack of capital. It made a world of difference to our company at the time. If someone had ever asked him, he'd say, I loaned that money because of Norm and his selling ability. He said, I knew he would grow with that money.
And the company grew and grew and grew. Norman naturally liked people, enjoyed them, accepted them. He did his selling on a basis of relationships. It's one thing to build relationships, but it's another to really be a great salesman who cares about his clients. And Norman did that. And Norman fought hard to make sure everything was done right for the clients. And he really had a salesman's mentality. But he was always in the people business. He was always selling to people and helping them.
He was really incredible. And I didn't even realize this myself until I became aware that everybody loved him. His clients became friends of ours for life.
On one occasion, I came out with my family and did the wining and dining and the factory visit. And then afterwards, Norman said, here, take my keys, go anywhere you want. I said, I planned on going up to Yellowstone. He says, well, take my car. Here's a man, gives me his car. I was gone for 4 days up in Yellowstone, and he was just, you know, that's the kind of guy he was. Extremely generous, not worrying about the small stuff.
I am especially fond of salespeople. Sales is what mattered. That makes us or breaks us. It didn't matter where or what. Norman Tanner was the ultimate salesman. He was always positive, optimistic, and he was so caring about all of the employees of the company. And he was proud of the company, and what he was most concerned about was that the little people were treated fairly and right. He used to call me often and say, are we treating you right? Are we treating the people right? And if the company does well, everybody shares in it. And Norman was especially concerned that people were given their fair share.
He never just sold products. He got involved with the person and the company and built a relationship. And I know from Barbara's and Norman's stories and the girls that they had people come from all over the country and stay at their home who were either clients or salespeople.
And as a team, they were terrific. They are the selling arm of O.C. Tanner because when he entertained, she was often there with the clients and the customers, and she was a huge asset and a very impressive, wonderful lady.
I think you have to be a team. You're not two people just living together, fighting for two different lifestyles or careers. If you're going to be successful, you're a team. You work together.
The other thing that you loved about them, you know, their athleticism. Norman and Barbara have done it all, you know, whether they hiked down the Grand Canyon and hiked up Pikes Peak. I used to love to see the two of them go out and play tennis because they were formidable. And if we had a mixed tennis tournament, they would win.
Well, we just skied a lot and loved it. It changed winter for me. But I never would have done it without Norm because I wouldn't have taken off on my own. And I probably wouldn't have played tennis. Oh, but Norman was a great mountain